My in-laws seated my parents at a folding table by the kitchen at my wedding. Then my mother-in-law said they should be grateful. I didn't notice it right away. That's the part that still gets me when I think back on it. I was standing at the front of that venue, watching my wife walk down the aisle toward me, and I was so focused on her face, on the way her dress caught the afternoon light coming through those tall windows, that I didn't even look at where everyone was sitting. I didn't scan the room. I didn't do a head count. I was just a man watching the woman he loved walk toward him, completely unaware that 60 feet behind me, in the corner nearest the kitchen entrance, my mother and father were seated at a rectangular folding table with a paper tablecloth, the kind you see at church potlucks, while every single one of my wife's relatives sat in chiavari chairs with satin cushions and custom centerpieces at round tables with linen so white it almost glowed. My parents didn't say a word during the ceremony. Not a word during cocktail hour either. My dad has this way of going quiet when something bothers him deeply, where he just becomes very still and very polite, and my mother mirrors him whenever he does that. So they smiled. They took pictures. My mom kept her purse on her lap the entire reception, which I now understand was because there was nowhere to hang it. No chair back, just a folding chair that wobbled slightly every time she shifted her weight. I found out what happened when my cousin pulled me aside during the last hour of the reception and said, "Hey man, I just want you to know I offered your parents my seat and they refused. I don't know who planned this, but it wasn't right." I didn't know what he was talking about. Then he pointed. And I looked. And something in my chest that had been warm all day went completely cold. I'm Declan, 34, male. My wife's family had money. Not generational wealth, not old money, but new money, the kind that comes with a very specific kind of social anxiety disguised as confidence. Her father built a regional distribution company from nothing in the 90s, and by the time I came into the picture, the family had been wealthy for just long enough to start acting like they always had been. Her mother was the architect of that performance. She curated everything about their image with a precision that I mistook, for a long time, for taste. Nice house, nice cars, nice clothes, nice opinions. All of it arranged like a stage set that was never allowed to reveal what was behind it. My family, by contrast, was working class in the most honest sense of that phrase. My father spent 31 years as a machinist. My mother worked part-time as a school secretary after my brother and I were old enough to stay home. We weren't poor. We weren't struggling in any dramatic way. But we didn't own things that signaled wealth, and that was enough for my mother-in-law to have decided, sometime before she'd even met them properly, that my parents were a different category of people than hers. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. My wife is not a villain in this story. She's a person who was raised inside a very particular kind of pressure, and she made choices I didn't agree with, and some of those choices hurt me deeply. But I need you to understand who she was before I explain what she did, or you won't understand why it took me as long as it did to see what was actually happening. We met at a work conference in Chicago. She was in marketing for a healthcare firm. I was in operations for a mid-size logistics company. We were at the same breakout session. We both thought the presenter was insufferable. We communicated this exclusively through eye contact for about 45 minutes, and then we went and got coffee together and talked for 4 hours. That was it. We dated long distance for 8 months before she relocated. We got engaged after 2 years. I thought I knew her. I thought I knew her completely. The wedding planning started 18 months before the date. From the very beginning, her mother inserted herself into every decision with a level of involvement that I told myself was just enthusiasm. She had opinions about the venue, the florist, the caterer, the invitation font, the centerpieces, the cocktail hour format, the music selection, the rehearsal dinner location, everything. And because my wife had grown up with her mother's opinions functioning as the weather, she navigated them the way you navigate weather. You don't argue with rain. You adjust. I noticed my wife adjusting constantly, and I told myself that was just how families like hers operated, that it would settle down after the wedding, that it wasn't worth making into a conflict. What I didn't know, what I would only find out much later, was that her mother had been financing parts of the wedding without telling me. Not the whole thing. We had a budget we'd set together, and I knew her parents were contributing a specific amount, and I thought that amount was defined and agreed upon. What I didn't know was that her mother had been making additional payments directly to vendors, quietly, and collecting those payments as leverage. It's the kind of thing that doesn't feel sinister when you first hear it. A mother helps pay for her daughter's wedding. That's just love, right? That's generosity. That's what you tell yourself. But the payments weren't generosity. They were an investment. And my mother-in-law expected returns on her investments. The seating chart was the return. I didn't find this out on my wedding day. I found out 3 weeks after the wedding, when I was going through some paperwork and came across a receipt my wife had left in a drawer. A payment confirmation from the venue that showed a different total than what we'd agreed to budget for table rentals. It was a small discrepancy. $47. But I'm an operations guy. Small discrepancies in numbers bother me. I asked my wife about it, and she went still in that way she sometimes went still, and I knew, the way you know things in a marriage before you have proof, that there was something she didn't want to tell me. It took 3 conversations over 2 days before she told me about the folding table. Here's what happened as close as I can reconstruct it. About 6 weeks before the wedding, her mother had approached the venue coordinator directly and requested a change to the seating layout. The round tables at our venue seated 8. We had 12 tables reserved for guests. The original seating chart, which my wife and I had built together at our kitchen table over a bottle of wine one Sunday afternoon, had my parents at table 4, a central table, good sight lines to the dance floor, near my wife's aunt and uncle who were about the same age and who my parents had met at the engagement party and genuinely liked. Her mother called the venue, identified herself as a co-host of the event, and had the chart modified. She moved my parents, and my aunt and uncle, and my cousin and his wife, to what the venue called a supplemental seating area near the service entrance to the kitchen. She replaced my family spots at table 4 with 2 of her own cousins who hadn't been on the original layout at all and who had, apparently, RSVP'd late. The venue coordinator later told me that she had flagged the change internally because it was unusual, but that she had no grounds to refuse it since the person calling had the account password, which my mother-in-law had obtained from my wife sometime earlier to help coordinate. My wife knew about the change. Not immediately, but she found out about a week before the wedding, when she called the venue to confirm the final headcount and the coordinator mentioned the supplemental seating area. My wife confronted her mother. Her mother told her it was a space issue, that the extra cousins had created a numbers problem, that it was the only logical solution. My wife told me she believed her. Or she told herself she believed her. I've thought a lot about the difference between those two things. What I know with certainty is this: my wife did not tell me. She made a choice to walk down that aisle knowing where my parents were sitting. She made a choice to let the day proceed. And then, while my parents sat at that folding table in the corner by the kitchen doors, eating wedding food off a paper tablecloth, listening to the sounds of the kitchen staff on the other side of that wall, she danced with her father 40 feet away. When I found out, the first thing I felt was not anger. It was something quieter and worse, a sense of a floor dropping away beneath me. Because if she knew about the table and didn't tell me, then the table wasn't just a seating chart problem. It was a data point. And when I started treating it as a data point instead of an isolated incident, other things began connecting in ways I had previously refused to see. I thought about the engagement party 18 months earlier, where my mother had offered to bring her honey cake, a recipe her grandmother brought from Poland, something our family has served at every celebration for 3 generations, and my mother-in-law had thanked her very sweetly and then served a professionally catered dessert spread without mentioning the cake, which sat in the kitchen untouched all evening. My mother never said anything. She just nodded and smiled and said the other desserts looked beautiful. I thought about the rehearsal dinner, which her parents had hosted, and which had been at a restaurant so expensive that my brother had quietly shown me the menu prices on his phone and whispered, "Are they trying to make your people feel underdressed on purpose?" I had told him he was being paranoid. I wasn't sure anymore. I thought about every holiday we'd spent at her parents' house where my parents had been invited but consistently seated away from the main conversation, where my dad's stories about his work were received with polite silence while her father's stories about his company received engaged follow-up questions. I had filed all of these moments away as social awkwardness, as generational difference, as the ordinary friction of 2 families merging. I had been doing exactly what her mother had trained everyone around her to do. finding the most charitable interpretation and committing to it. The table was not a mistake. It was a policy. And my wife had not told me because some part of her, some deep conditioned part, had decided her mother's policies were weather, not choices. I sat with that for almost a week before I said anything. I went to work. I came home. I cooked dinner twice. I held my wife's hand while we watched TV. And inside, I was doing something I'd never done in our relationship before. I was taking inventory. When I finally brought it up, I did it calmly. That surprised her. I think she had been waiting for the explosion, been waiting for a while maybe, and when I sat down across from her at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and said, "I need you to tell me everything you know about the seating arrangement at our wedding," she looked at me like I was someone she didn't entirely recognize. Good. That meant she was paying attention. She told me. All of it. She cried through most of it. She said she had been wrong not to tell me, that she knew it was wrong, that she had convinced herself it wasn't as bad as it looked, that she hadn't wanted to ruin the day, that she was sorry. She reached across the table and put her hand on mine and said, "I'm so sorry, Declan. I should have stood up to her. I should have told you." I didn't move my hand. But I didn't hold hers back either. Did she say anything to my parents? I asked. Directly, I mean. Did she say anything to them about where they were sitting? My wife's face changed. It did that thing it sometimes does where the expression shifts like weather rolling in. I heard her say something to your mom at one point during cocktail hour, she said. I don't know exactly what was said. What did you hear? She took a breath. She said they should be grateful to be there. There it was. Not a misunderstanding. Not a tone that could be reinterpreted. Not a cultural difference or a social miscalculation. My mother-in-law had looked at my mother, a woman who had worked part-time and raised 2 sons and baked honey cake for 3 generations of family celebrations, and told her she should be grateful to be at her own son's wedding. I asked my wife why she hadn't told me that part. She didn't answer for a long time. Then she said, "Because I knew what it would mean if I did." I appreciated the honesty. It didn't help. I called my mother that night. I asked her how she was doing, and she said fine, and I said I'd heard the wedding venue had some issues with the seating and I was sorry if it was uncomfortable. Long silence. Then my mom said, "Declan, we were fine. Don't worry about it." Which is exactly what my mother says when she is not fine and also has decided not to make it your problem. I pushed. Gently. I told her I knew about the table. I told her I knew what my mother-in-law had said to her. My mother went very quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She's a difficult woman. I just didn't want to cause trouble at your wedding." What exactly did she say, Mom? Another pause. My mother has this dignity. I don't know how else to describe it. This way of carrying herself that doesn't perform. She doesn't need you to know she was hurt. She just carries it and keeps going. But sometimes when she speaks about something that genuinely wounded her, you can hear the seam of it in her voice, right at the edge of the words. She came over to where we were sitting, my mother said. She crouched down next to me very low like she was going to tell me a secret. And she said, "I hope you understand we did our best with what we had. Not everyone can have everything they want at these things. You should be grateful you're here." And then she patted my hand and walked away. She patted my hand. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I said, "Mom, I'm going to fix this. Declan, I know you don't want me to cause trouble, but this isn't causing trouble. This is something else." I didn't tell her what I was planning because at that point, I didn't fully know yet. What I knew was that my mother-in-law had made a calculated decision to humiliate my parents at my wedding, had used financial leverage to do it, had enlisted my wife's silence to protect it, and then had looked my mother in the eye and told her to be grateful. And I knew that the kind of person who does that doesn't stop at one occasion. They stop when they're stopped. The next thing I did was start paying attention to money. This is going to sound cold. I understand that. My wife and I had merged our finances when we got engaged. Joint checking, joint savings, shared expenses. We were partners. But I had always handled the operational side of our finances, the budgeting, the tracking, while she handled the relationship side, the communication with vendors, with family, with her parents specifically. What I had not done in 2 years of engagement and 6 months of marriage was look carefully at the full picture of where money had moved. I spent a weekend going through statements, joint account, my individual savings, the wedding budget spreadsheet we'd built together. I was not snooping for wrongdoing. I was looking for patterns. And I found them. Over the course of 18 months of wedding planning, her mother had made 8 separate direct payments to vendors totaling just over $14,000. I had known about roughly $4,000 of it, a contribution toward catering that we'd discussed and agreed on. The remaining $10,000 had been paid without my knowledge. To the florist. To the venue for upgrades we hadn't discussed. To a day of coordinator her mother had hired without mentioning it to me. To the invitation company, for a more expensive paper stock than the one we'd selected. $10,000 invisibly moving through our wedding, and I hadn't known. But here was the part that actually took my breath away. 3 of those payments had been made from an account that I could trace, through the vendor receipts, back to my wife's name. Not her mother's name. My wife's name. There was a separate account, one I hadn't known about, that had received deposits from her mother and had made payments to vendors. It was, in effect, a parallel financial arrangement running alongside our shared one. I sat with that for a long time. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds. And I want to be fair to my wife, because she is a complicated person and not an evil one. But what I was looking at was evidence that she had maintained a financial relationship with her mother that she had concealed from me. Not necessarily for malicious reasons. Possibly out of habit. She had been managing her mother's involvement in her life for as long as she'd been an adult, and part of managing it meant keeping it compartmentalized. Possibly out of fear. If her mother's money was visible to me, I might refuse it, and refusing it might create a conflict she didn't want to have. Possibly out of something she hadn't fully examined herself. But possibly also because some part of her had known, from the beginning, that her mother's money came with strings, and she had decided to let those strings exist in a space I couldn't see. I didn't confront my wife about the account right away. I told myself it was because I needed more information. The real reason was that I didn't trust myself to have that conversation without breaking something between us that I wasn't sure could be repaired. Instead, I went to see her father. This was a calculated decision. He was not his wife. He was not warm, exactly. He had the social energy of a man who had spent decades focused on building something and hadn't fully learned the language of family outside the boardroom. But he had always been fair to me. He'd told me once, at a family dinner maybe 6 months into my wife and I dating, that he respected people who were precise about things. "You mean what you say," he'd said to me. "I can see it. That's not common." It was a compliment delivered like a contract term, but it was genuine. I believed that about him. I called him and asked if we could have lunch. Just the 2 of us. He said yes without asking why, which I took as its own kind of signal. We met at a diner near his office. His choice, which interested me. Not a restaurant that signaled wealth. Just a diner, the kind with laminated menus and coffee that comes without asking. He was already there when I arrived, reading something on his phone, and he put it down when I sat down with a completeness that meant he was actually present. Some people put their phone down and they're still half somewhere else. He wasn't. He was there. We ordered. We made small talk about logistics and weather for approximately 2 minutes, which seemed to be the amount of small talk he considered appropriate before getting to things. Then he put his coffee cup down and looked at me directly and said, "Something happened at the wedding." It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. "The seating," he said. "You knew." He looked at me in a way that was harder to read than I expected. I found out after. Not before. He picked up his coffee. That wouldn't have happened if I'd known beforehand. "Why are you telling me that?" "Because I imagine you're wondering whether I was part of it." I wasn't. I want that on the table. I believed him. Not because he said it, but because of the specificity of his denial. Not I didn't know about anything, but I wasn't part of it. The precision of it. He'd drawn an exact boundary. She said something to my mother. I told him. He closed his eyes briefly. Not dramatically. Just a single moment of something that looked like exhaustion. "I know," he said. "Your wife told me." That surprised me. When? 2 days after the wedding. She came to my office. She was upset. He turned his coffee cup in a circle on the table, not drinking it. "I want you to know I spoke to my wife about it." Seriously. That kind of thing is not okay. I told her that. What did she say? He was quiet for a moment. She said your mother overreacted. I let that sit in the air between us. She believes what she believes, he said. There was something resigned in it. Not defeat, exactly, but the sound of a man who had been navigating a particular terrain for a long time and knew its contours by heart. "I'm not here to ask you to fix it," I said. "I need to understand something else." He waited. "The money," I said. "The payments to the vendors. The account in my wife's name." Something crossed his face that I couldn't entirely name. Not surprise. He was too controlled for surprise to show clearly. But something shifted. "How much do you know?" he asked. Enough to have questions. He nodded slowly. He was quiet for long enough that I thought he might redirect, might put on a boardroom face and deflect, might choose loyalty to his wife over honesty with me. And then he said something that rearranged everything I thought I understood about my situation. "The account has been there since she was 23, he said. "My wife set it up. It was framed as a safety net. Money my wife put in that my daughter could access if she ever needed it without having to ask." He paused. "It's been used that way sometimes. And other times it's been used as a line of communication. Between my wife and my daughter. Financial. Private. Did you know about it?" He looked at me steadily. "I found out about it 4 years ago. We had a significant disagreement about it." Another pause. "My wife does not see it as a problem. She sees it as a mother providing for her child." "And you?" "I see it as a method of control," he said, very quietly, like the words were something he'd said before in private and was now saying out loud for the first time. "And I have not been able to convince my wife otherwise." The diner was busy around us. Plates clattering, a TV on somewhere, the ordinary noise of a Tuesday lunch hour. And in the middle of all of it, my father-in-law had just told me something that confirmed the worst version of what I'd been afraid of. This wasn't new. This wasn't something that started with the wedding planning. My mother-in-law had been running a financial and emotional shadow network around my wife for years. The wedding was just one application of a system that had been in place since my wife was in her 20s. And my wife, my brilliant, warm, complicated wife, had grown up inside that system and had never fully named what it was, because when you grow up inside something, it just feels like how things are. I drove home thinking about a word. Leverage. My mother-in-law had leverage. Financial leverage through the payments and the account. Social leverage through her ability to move through venues and vendors and family. Relationships as a co-host and an authority figure. Emotional leverage through my wife's deeply conditioned need to avoid direct conflict with her mother. And narrative leverage, because if this ever became a conflict, if it ever became a story that got told, her version was already preloaded. She was a generous mother who paid for things and tried to help, and if her son-in-law was upset about it, that was ingratitude. I needed to dismantle the leverage. Carefully. Legally. Without blowing up my marriage in the process. The first thing I did was consult an attorney. Not a divorce attorney. I wasn't there yet, I didn't want to be there, and I wasn't going to make decisions about my marriage while I was operating from pain. I consulted a financial attorney, someone who handled civil disputes, to understand what my actual situation was regarding the undisclosed payments, the parallel account, and the vendor modifications. The attorney, a woman in her 50s who had the very specific energy of someone who had heard every variety of family financial dysfunction and was no longer surprised by any of it, listened to everything I laid out, asked about a dozen precise questions, and then told me a few things I needed to know. First, the undisclosed payments to vendors were not, strictly speaking, fraud. They were third-party gifts to vendors on behalf of an event, and while they were made without my explicit consent as a co-host, They were not legally actionable unless I could prove they were made in bad faith with intent to harm. Second, the private account in my wife's name was my wife's account, not mine, and its existence was not inherently illegal even though she hadn't disclosed it to me during our engagement. This might be relevant in certain contexts but was not in itself a lawsuit. Third, and this was the thing that I sat with, some of the vendor modification requests had been made by my mother-in-law to vendors using information that was exclusively in my wife's possession, like account passwords and booking confirmation numbers. If my wife had provided that information knowingly, that was worth understanding more carefully. I want to pause here because I can feel people reading this and forming an opinion, and I want to complicate it slightly before it solidifies. There's a version of this story where my wife is a clear co-conspirator, where she handed her mother the keys knowingly and then played innocent after the fact. I've thought about that version. I've sat in rooms with it. But here's what I keep coming back to. My wife grew up in a house where her mother's involvement was total and unquestioned, where financial support and emotional support were inseparable, where love was expressed through control so consistently that they had become the same thing in her nervous system. She gave her mother account passwords the same way you'd tell a family member where the spare key is. Not as a strategic act, as a reflex, as something that was normal because it had always been normal. That doesn't make it okay. It doesn't mean there aren't consequences, but it means the cause of it isn't malice. It's conditioning. And those are two very different things with two very different solutions. I had that conversation with my wife. All of it. The attorney, the account, the passwords, the parallel financial relationship she'd been maintaining since she was 23. I laid it out on the kitchen table between us like a map, and I sat across from her and watched her look at it. She cried. She said she hadn't thought of it as hiding anything. She said her mother's financial involvement in her life had always just been part of the background. She hadn't thought to mention it to me the same way she hadn't thought to mention what shampoo she used, because it was just there, it was just how things were, it had never occurred to her that it was something I needed to know. I told her I believed she believed that. But do you believe it's true? She asked. No, I said. I don't think you didn't mention it because it seemed mundane. I think you didn't mention it because some part of you knew that if I saw it clearly, I'd ask questions about it. And those questions would have created a confrontation with your mother. And you've spent your entire life avoiding that confrontation. She didn't argue with that. She sat there and breathed carefully and didn't argue with it, which told me I'd said something accurate. I need that to change, I said. Not over time. No. I need you to understand that I can't be in a marriage where your mother has a financial and operational stake in our lives that I can't see. It's not about the money. It's not even about the table, not really. It's about what the table means. It means she has the power to make unilateral decisions about our lives and face no consequence for it. And if that stays true, it will never stop. What are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to close the account. I'm asking you to have a conversation with your mother about the wedding. Not to yell at her, not to explode, but to make clear that what she did was not acceptable. And I'm asking you to not share financial or logistical information about our life with her without telling me first. My wife looked at the table for a long time. Then she looked at me. And if I do all of that, she said, are we okay? I don't know yet, I said. But we have a chance. I'm going to tell you what happened with my mother-in-law before I tell you what my wife decided. Because the two things happened on parallel tracks, and they need to be understood separately to make sense together. About 3 weeks after the conversation with my wife, I reached out to the venue coordinator who had flagged the seating change. I told her I was following up on some discrepancies from the event and asked if she'd be willing to provide documentation of the modification request. Specifically, who had called, what information they had provided, and when the change had been made. She was helpful, professional, and apparently happy to put in writing that the modification had been requested by someone who identified herself as a co-host and had provided booking credentials. I had that in writing within a week. I also reached out to 2 of the vendors, the florist and the day of coordinator, and simply asked for copies of invoices and payment confirmations. Both were straightforward. Business requests. Both complied. I had documentation showing payments made from my wife's ancillary account, in her name, to vendors, for modifications and upgrades that I had not agreed to. I assembled this documentation very quietly and stored it. Not to take to court. Not to use against my wife. To have. To be the kind of person who has documentation when documentation is needed. My father-in-law had taught me something at that diner. Precision matters. You don't bring something to a table unless you can show it clearly. My mother-in-law called me about a month after the wedding. This was, as far as I could tell, a routine check-in call, the kind she made periodically, always very warm, always ending with some reference to plans or family events that implicitly included her as the organizing force. She asked how I was settling in, how work was going, whether my wife and I had given any thought to Thanksgiving. I let her talk. I asked a few questions. I was pleasant. And then, near the end of the call, I said, "I wanted to mention something. About the wedding." Brief pause. "Of course. Was everything okay?" "I thought it went beautifully." "The venue was beautiful," I said. "But I want to talk about the seating arrangement." Another pause, this one longer. "The seating," she said, with the tone of someone confirming they've heard the word correctly before they decide what to do with it. "My parents were seated at a folding table near the kitchen service entrance," I said. "I've since found out that the original seating chart was modified at your request." "Declan." Her voice shifted into something warm and firm simultaneously. The tone of someone who is experienced at managing this kind of moment. "I can understand if it looked." "I also spoke with my mother," I said. "She told me what you said to her during the reception." Silence. "I think you should know that I know everything," I said. "The seating change, the vendor modifications, the payments through the private account. I have documentation of all of it." I paused. "I'm not calling to threaten you. I'm calling to make sure we understand each other. What happened at that wedding is not something that can happen again, in any form. And I need to know that you understand that." When she finally spoke, her voice had changed. The warmth was still there, but it was stretched thin over something harder. "I was trying to help," she said. "I put a significant amount of my own money into that wedding." "I know exactly how much money you put in," I said. "I have the receipts." Pause. "I just think you should appreciate." "I think," I said carefully, "that what I appreciate is not the issue. The issue is that you made changes to our wedding without my knowledge or consent. You moved my parents to a location that was demeaning. And then you told my mother she should be grateful to be there." I let that sit for a moment. "I'm her son. I'm your daughter's husband. And I'm telling you clearly, that will not happen again." The call ended shortly after that. She said something about hoping we could all move forward and family being important and not wanting there to be tension. I agreed that family was important. I said I hoped we could move forward too. I meant it. But I said it from a different position than she was used to dealing with. What I found out later, from my father-in-law, who had apparently been listening from another room during the call because she had put me on speaker without telling me, which I found unsurprising, was that she was shaken by it. Not apologetic. Not remorseful in any clean way. But shaken. Because the version of events she had been operating from required me not to know the things I knew. My knowing them changed the geometry of everything. My wife had the conversation with her mother 2 days later. I know what was said because my wife told me about it that evening. Came home from it quieter than I'd ever seen her, sat down on the couch and said, "She cried. She said I was choosing you over her. She said she'd done everything for me and I was throwing it back in her face." My wife looked at her hands. And I told her that choosing my husband isn't choosing against her. And she said that was something I would say if I'd been influenced. "She used that word," I said. "Yes." "And what did you say?" My wife looked up at me. I said, "Mom, I love you. But what you did at the wedding was wrong. And if you can't acknowledge that, then I need some space to figure out what that means for us." She paused. And then I left. I want to be honest about what happened in me when she said that. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't relief exactly. It was something more like watching a person stand up for the first time after a long time on the floor. Something that has the quality of witnessing, not of winning. "Are you okay?" I asked her. "No," she said, "but I think I will be." The account was closed within the week. My wife handled it herself, without prompting from me on the timeline. She also went through our shared finances with me, fully, openly, from the beginning, and we built a new picture together of what our financial life actually looked like. It was the kind of conversation I had imagined having before the wedding and hadn't known to make happen. The Thanksgiving question was answered simply. We spent it with my parents. Just us and them at my parents' house, at a table that had been in their kitchen for 26 years. My mother made her honey cake. My dad told a long story about a machine malfunction from 1987 that only makes sense if you know a lot about machining, which none of us do, but we all listened to the whole thing anyway. My wife sat next to my father and asked him follow-up questions, and I watched him light up in a way I hadn't seen in a while, and I thought, this is what it's supposed to look like. My mother-in-law did not accept the explanation of our absence gracefully. There were several phone calls, several texts to my wife that escalated in emotional intensity over a 2-week period, ending in one message that said, in full, "I hope you both realize what you're destroying." My wife did not respond to it. She showed it to me, and then she set her phone face down on the coffee table, and we finished watching the thing we'd been watching, and later she said, "I'm going to need a therapist, I think." I said that sounded like a good idea. Now, I want to tell you about Christmas. Because Christmas is where the full shape of everything revealed itself, and I didn't see it coming in the way I thought I was prepared to see things coming. Her parents hosted Christmas. We went. This was a joint decision, an attempt at the beginning of a normalized relationship on new terms. My parents were also invited, which was a first, and which had happened at my direct request. My mother-in-law had agreed to it with a warmth that felt practiced but not hostile. I took it as a possible beginning. The evening went reasonably well for about 3 hours. My parents and her parents sat in the living room with everyone else, at chairs and couches that were actual furniture, and my father talked about football and her father engaged with it genuinely, and my mother and the aunt who had been at the wedding talked about recipes, and things were fragile but they were surface level okay. And then my mother-in-law came in from the kitchen carrying a beautifully arranged cheese plate and set it on the coffee table, and said brightly to the room, "I found the most wonderful cheese shop, and I made sure to get a selection that I thought everyone could appreciate. Some simpler options for those of us who aren't used to." She stopped herself. She stopped herself because she saw my face. I hadn't made a sound. I hadn't moved. But something in my expression. I don't know what she saw there exactly, but whatever it was, she stopped mid-sentence and the room shifted. My wife had seen it too. My father-in-law had seen it too. My mother-in-law looked at the cheese plate and then back at the room and said, brightly but slightly disconnected from the moment, "Different varieties. There's something for everyone." And then she set the plate down and went back to the kitchen. My mother looked at me. I shook my head slightly. She nodded. Later, after dinner, while my wife was helping clear the table and my father was talking to her father in the hallway, my mother-in-law found me alone in the living room. She sat down across from me with the deliberate calm of a person who has decided something. And she said, "I know you don't like me." I looked at her for a moment. "I don't dislike you," I said. "I think you love your daughter. I think you love your family. I think the way you've expressed that has caused real harm, and I think you haven't fully accepted that." She was quiet. Then, "I worked very hard for this family." "I know you did. And I was trying," she paused. "I wanted the wedding to be beautiful. I wanted it to reflect what our family is." "And what about what my family is?" I said. It came out without sharpness. It was just a question and I let it sit in the air as a question. She didn't answer it. She looked at her hands. Then she said something I didn't expect. My mother was, "We didn't have much. Growing up. And when I had all this, I needed it to be different. I needed people to see that it was different." She stopped. "I understand that's not an excuse." "No," I said. "It's not. But it might be a reason." I thought about that for a moment. And I said, "The difference between a reason and an excuse is what you do with it. A reason explains the behavior. What you do next is on you." She nodded. "Once. Slowly. My mother baked a honey cake for your daughter's engagement party, I said. It sat in your kitchen untouched. She didn't say anything about it because she's not the kind of person who makes things about herself. But I need you to know I remember it. I need you to know I've been watching, even when you assumed I wasn't. Another long silence. What do you want from me? She asked. And for the first time since I'd known her, the question sounded real. I want you to see my family, I said. Not as a problem to manage. Not as people who are different from yours in ways that make them less. Just as people, my people, who are now your people by marriage, whether that's convenient or not. She looked at me for a long time. I couldn't fully read what was happening behind her eyes. But she said, I'll try. I nodded. Good. My wife and I drove home that night mostly in silence. The comfortable kind that exists between two people who have been through something together and don't need to debrief it immediately. We were almost home when she said, What did you say to her? The truth, I said. Just the truth. She reached over and put her hand on mine on the gear shift. I held it this time. I want to tell you what happened in the months after that. Because this doesn't end at Christmas. It doesn't end cleanly at all, really, which is probably the most honest thing I can tell you about it. My mother-in-law did not transform overnight into a different person. She remained someone who had strong opinions about social arrangements and expressed them in ways that were often overstepping. She continued to find subtle ways to signal status that required ongoing navigation. She did not, to my knowledge, ever fully apologize to my mother. Not in the direct, unqualified way that would have meant everything. But things changed in increments. She started including my parents in invitations. She remembered my mother's dietary restrictions without having to be reminded after the second family dinner. At Easter, she served my mother's honey cake. My wife had suggested it, and she had agreed. She put it on the table herself, with a card that said the recipe had come from our family. My mother saw it and looked at my wife and then at me, and didn't say anything, just smiled in a way that meant everything. Progress is slower than drama. It is grainier and less satisfying to watch in real time than a story wants it to be. I didn't get the moment where my mother-in-law stood up in front of the whole family and acknowledged what she'd done. I didn't get a full confession or a public reckoning. What I got was slow evidence of a person recalibrating, reluctantly, because the alternative had been made clearly and specifically unavailable. Which brings me to the thing I've thought about most, the thing I keep turning over. Was it enough? My parents know what happened. Not all of it. Not the financial details, not the attorney consultation, not the full documentation. But they know their son found out what was done to them and that he did not let it go. My dad, who is not a sentimental man, called me one evening about 6 months after the wedding and said, out of almost nowhere, "You're a good son. I want you to know that." And that was the whole thing. That was the whole conversation. And I sat in my car after and held the phone for a while. My wife is in therapy. Has been for 10 months. She is doing the kind of work that is genuinely hard. Not the surface processing of events, but the deeper excavation of why she normalized what she normalized and what it cost her over the years. She comes home from sessions sometimes looking wrung out in a way that I've learned to recognize as productive. She is becoming, incrementally, someone who can name what her mother does in real time rather than only in retrospect. That is not a small thing. We are still married. We are not the same as we were before the wedding, and I don't think we will be, and I'm not sure we should be. What we are is more honest. We know more about each other than we did. More difficult things, more complicated things, and we're still here. I think that means something. I think that's the actual foundation, the one that didn't exist before because we'd never needed it. The documentation I assembled is still in a folder on my laptop. I've never needed to use it. Maybe I never will. But I have it. That's the thing my father-in-law and I understood about each other at that diner. Sometimes having something and never using it is what the having is for. I want to say something about my mother-in-law's origin story. The detail she gave me at Christmas, about growing up without money, about needing to signal difference, about the performance of having made it. I've thought about it a lot. I don't think it excuses what she did. I don't think suffering is a blank check for causing harm. But I understand the mechanism of it now in a way I didn't before, and understanding it has made me angrier in some ways and less angry in others. Angrier because she should have been able to see what she was doing clearly enough to stop it. She's not a stupid woman, and she had access to the same self-awareness we all have access to if we're willing to look. Less angry because the thing she was afraid of, being seen as less than, being reduced, being categorized as someone who doesn't quite belong, is a fear I can locate in myself too in smaller doses. We are all, in some form, performing the distance between who we were and who we want people to think we are. What I won't accept is when that performance requires my parents to sit at a folding table by the kitchen so that someone else's stage set stays clean. I've told this story to a few people over the past year. Not publicly until now. Every time I've told it, there's a point somewhere in the middle where people start to divide. Some people think I should have confronted my mother-in-law immediately, at the reception, publicly, the moment my cousin pointed. Some people think I handled it too softly, that she deserved more direct consequence than a phone call and a hard conversation. Some people think the problem was always my wife's, that no matter what her mother did, my wife's choice to stay silent was the central betrayal, and that I was too forgiving of it. Some people think my wife was a victim of her upbringing and that forgiving her was the only right answer. Some people think I should have walked away from the marriage. I don't think any of these takes are entirely wrong. I think that's what makes the whole thing hard to resolve in a tidy way. What I know is this: I did not yell. I did not threaten. I did not blow anything up in the heat of the moment when I would have said things that were true but destructive in ways I hadn't thought through. I gathered information. I moved precisely. I made sure the people who needed to understand things understood them fully, with documentation that made the story undeniable. And I made clear to everyone involved that there was a new floor below which things would not go, and that the floor was my parents' dignity. That's it. That's the thing I'll hold on to. The floor. Once you set it, you have to hold it. No exceptions, no softening it for convenience, no letting it slip because there are holidays coming up and everyone wants things to be fine. The floor is the floor. My dad had a machinist's expression he used when he was teaching me how something worked and I was getting impatient with the precision it required. He'd say, "Measure twice, cut once. The wood doesn't care how you feel about it." I've thought about that a lot this year. In the middle of everything, when I wanted to cut, to confront, to expose, to make it loud and public and undeniable, I kept measuring. And when I finally cut, it was in exactly the right place. I don't know if this story ends the way you wanted it to. There's no single moment of total vindication, no scene where my mother-in-law stands in front of everyone and breaks down and acknowledges every specific thing she did wrong. Life doesn't produce those scenes reliably. What it produces is accumulation of evidence, of small decisions, of incremental change, of relationships that shift slowly under consistent pressure. But at Easter this past year, my mother sat at the main table, in a Chiavari chair with a satin cushion, across from my mother-in-law. And they talked, not deeply, not without awkwardness, not perfectly, but they talked. And when it was time for dessert, my mother's honey cake was on the table, with a card, and everyone ate it. My mother-in-law had 2 slices. I watched my mother's face when she saw the cake on the table. She looked at me first, just a glance, just a fraction of a second, and then she looked away and sat down and started talking to my cousin's wife like it was nothing, like everything was perfectly normal. She is a gracious woman, my mother. She carries things quietly and then sets them down when it's time. I got some of that from her, I think. The measuring, the patience, the understanding that dignity doesn't require an audience. If there's something I want people to take from this, and I'm not sure I'm in a position to draw lessons because I made mistakes in this too, plenty of them, it would be this: entitlement doesn't correct itself. It only recalibrates under consistent, clear, documented, legally grounded, emotionally steady pressure. You don't win against it by exploding. You win against it by becoming the most reliably precise person in the room. And you make sure your mother has a seat at the table. Not a folding table. The table. The actual one, with the real cloth and the candles and the place card with her name on it. That's the whole thing. That's what it was always about. If you've stayed with this story all the way to here, you know how deep these family dynamics can really cut. If you want to hear more real stories like this, subscribe. We're just getting started.